The execution chamber's clock read 11:47 p.m. when Thomas Richardson's hands trembled against the cold metal table, the same tremor that had shaken him 7 years ago when the handcuffs first clicked shut. His final request hadn't been for a priest or a last meal. It had been to see Zeus, his German shepherd, one more time. The warden's radio crackled like distant thunder from his childhood storms in Colorado, when Zeus would press against his legs during his worst PTSD episodes. 12 minutes until the lethal injection. 12 minutes until a truth buried for 7 years would explode through the Arizona State Prison like shrapnel through his old squad in Afghanistan. Outside, December wind howled through the razor wire exactly as it had the night Detective Marcus Webb framed him for Robert Hayes's murder. Same wind, same lies, same innocent man about to die. But this time, Zeus's instincts would finally be heard. The intercom buzzed. "We have a problem. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now." Let's continue with the story. Thomas "Tommy" Richardson had never expected his life to end at 34, strapped to a gurney in Arizona State Prison. The boy who once dreamed of fixing cars like his father had instead learned to fix broken Humvees in the dusty streets of Kandahar. The 82nd Airborne Division had taught him brotherhood, honor, and how to survive when bullets flew like angry hornets through Afghan heat. But nothing had prepared him for December 15, 2017, when Sergeant Marcus Chen stepped on that IED outside Forward Operating Base Chapman. Tommy had been walking 3 feet behind him, 3 feet that separated life from death, coming home from never coming home again. The explosion still echoed in his nightmares, metal screaming, dust choking, and Chen's blood mixing with desert sand while Tommy lay unconscious, wondering why he'd been spared. Coming home to Flagstaff in 2013 should have been a blessing. Instead, it felt like punishment. The mountain town's crisp air reminded him of everything clean he'd lost overseas. His parents had died in a car accident while he was deployed, leaving him Richardson's auto repair and an empty house that echoed with ghosts. The nightmares came every night, Chen calling his name, explosions that weren't there, the smell of burning fuel that existed only in his broken mind. That's when Zeus entered his life. A 3-year-old German shepherd with hip problems that ended his police K-9 career. The Flagstaff Animal Shelter had 3 days before putting him down when Tommy walked in, looking for something, anything to fill the silence. Zeus limped when he walked, favoring his left rear leg, but his dark eyes held the same wounded recognition Tommy saw in his own mirror. For 4 years, they healed each other. Zeus learned to wake Tommy gently from nightmares, placing a careful paw on his chest instead of barking. Tommy learned to trust again, pouring his heart into teaching Zeus new tricks, long walks through Coconino National Forest, and quiet evenings in the garage where Zeus would lie beside his workbench, content to simply exist together. Zeus never left the garage property, not once. He seemed to understand that this place, filled with the smell of motor oil and the sound of wrenches on metal, was their sanctuary. Customers learned to expect the gentle German shepherd who would greet them with a wagging tail, but always return to Tommy's side. Detective Marcus Webb had been watching them both for months before the murder. A 15-year veteran of the Flagstaff Police Department, Webb carried his own scars. The death of his 8-year-old son David in a car accident caused by a drunk veteran had twisted something fundamental inside him. When Robert Hayes was found dead with $50,000 missing from his safe, Webb saw an opportunity for the kind of justice the courts would never provide. Tommy never saw it coming. Neither did Zeus, who trusted the uniformed man right up until the tranquilizer dart dropped him unconscious in his own garage. The night Robert Hayes died, Tommy Richardson was dreaming of Afghanistan again. The nightmare always started the same way, Chen's voice calling his name across the desert. the metallic click of boots on gravel. Then the world exploding in fire and shrapnel. Zeus woke him at 3:17 a.m. with a gentle paw to the chest, the way he'd done countless times before. Tommy's heart hammered against his ribs as he sat up, drenched in sweat, reaching automatically for the warm fur of his companion. "Thanks, boy," he whispered, scratching behind Zeus's ears. The German shepherd's tail thumped once against the floor before he settled back down, ever watchful. Tommy padded to the kitchen, bare feet cold against linoleum, and started the coffee. Through the window, Flagstaff slept under a blanket of December stars, peaceful and unaware that 15 miles away, a man was bleeding out on his living room floor. Robert Hayes had built his fortune on legitimate businesses: a chain of auto parts stores, a small trucking company, real estate investments throughout northern Arizona. What the community didn't know was that Hayes had been laundering money for a Mexican cartel for over 3 years, using his businesses as fronts for moving dirty cash. His partner, Vincent Morrison, had gambling debts that exceeded his legitimate income by hundreds of thousands of dollars. When Morrison asked Hayes for a loan to cover his debts, Hayes refused. The argument that followed turned violent. Morrison had come prepared, carrying a .38 special that he'd purchased illegally 6 months earlier. The first shot caught Hayes in the chest as he tried to reach for his phone. The second shot, fired as Hayes crawled toward his safe, proved fatal. Morrison ransacked the house, taking $50,000 in cash from the safe and another $20,000 from Hayes's desk drawer. Detective Marcus Webb arrived at the scene at 4:43 a.m., responding to a 911 call from Hayes's neighbor who had heard gunshots. Webb found Morrison standing over the body, gun still in his trembling hand, cash scattered across the floor. In that moment, Webb faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. Morrison looked up with wild eyes, blood spattered across his white shirt. "Jesus, Marcus. Jesus Christ, I didn't mean for this to happen." Webb had known Morrison for 15 years, ever since Morrison had started dating Webb's sister-in-law. He'd arrested Morrison twice for drunk and disorderly conduct, helped him through his divorce, even lent him money when times got tough. But standing in Hayes's living room, surrounded by the evidence of murder, Webb saw something else entirely, an opportunity for a different kind of justice. "David would have been 9 years old next month," Webb said quietly, holstering his weapon. His son had died 11 months earlier, killed by a drunk veteran who ran a red light while racing to meet friends at a bar. The veteran got 7 years for vehicular manslaughter, 7 years for stealing Webb's entire world. Morrison wiped blood from his hands with a dish rag. "I know, man. I know how much that hurt you." "25,000, Webb said, staring at the cash on the floor. "Give me 25,000 and I'll make this someone else's problem." The conspiracy took shape quickly. Morrison would leave through the back door, taking his car, and disappearing for 72 hours. Webb would plant the murder weapon and stage evidence pointing to a different killer. Specifically, a troubled veteran with PTSD who lived alone and had no solid alibi. Webb had been building a mental list of such targets for months, and Tommy Richardson fit perfectly. At 5:15 a.m., while Tommy slept peacefully with Zeus curled beside his bed, Webb broke into Richardson's auto repair through the back door. He knew the layout from bringing his patrol car there for maintenance. The garage was dark and quiet except for Zeus's soft breathing from the corner where he slept on an old blanket. Webb moved carefully, placing the .38 special behind a toolbox where it would be easily discovered. He'd lifted Tommy's fingerprints from a traffic stop 3 weeks earlier, carefully preserving them on evidence tape. Now, he pressed Tommy's prints onto the gun's handle, creating what would appear to be damning evidence. Zeus stirred but didn't wake, trusting the scent of someone he'd met before. Webb had been counting on that trust, and it served his purpose perfectly. By dawn, Webb had destroyed the security footage from Hayes's home, altered his initial report to remove any mention of Morrison, and created a timeline that would place Tommy at the scene during the estimated time of death. When backup officers arrived, Webb played the role of thorough investigator, directing them to evidence he'd already planted. At 7:30 a.m., as Tommy fed Zeus his morning kibble and prepared for another day of honest work, 20 officers surrounded Richardson's auto repair with guns drawn and a warrant for murder in the first degree. The sound of shattering glass pierced the morning quiet as 20 officers surrounded Richardson's auto repair. Tommy had been underneath a 1995 Ford pickup changing the oil filter when the first bullhorn crackled to life outside his garage. Zeus immediately went rigid, his ears snapping forward as he positioned himself between Tommy and the front entrance. "Thomas Richardson, this is the Flagstaff Police Department. Come out with your hands visible." Tommy rolled out from under the truck, motor oil staining his coveralls, confusion written across his weathered face. Through the garage's windows he could see patrol cars arranged in a semicircle, their red and blue lights painting the morning in harsh, pulsing colors. Officers crouched behind their vehicles, weapons drawn and trained on his shop. "Zeus, stay," Tommy commanded softly, but the German Shepherd was already moving, placing himself directly in front of his owner. The dog's lips pulled back in a silent snarl, every muscle tensed for action. In 4 years together, Tommy had never seen Zeus react with such immediate, instinctive aggression toward law enforcement. Detective Marcus Webb stepped forward, megaphone in hand, his face a mask of professional composure. But Tommy caught something else in Webb's eyes, a cold satisfaction that seemed out of place for a routine arrest. "Mr. Richardson, we have a warrant for your arrest in connection with the murder of Robert Hayes. Exit the building slowly with your hands raised." Murder. The word hit Tommy like physical blow, stealing his breath and making his knees weak. Robert Hayes had brought his Chevy Suburban to the shop just 2 weeks ago for brake work. They'd talked about the weather, about Tommy's military service, about Hayes's plans to expand his business. Now Hayes was dead, and somehow impossibly, they thought Tommy had killed him. "There's been a mistake," Tommy called out, his voice cracking. "I don't know what you think I did, but—" "Exit the building now, or we're coming in," Webb interrupted, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Tommy looked down at Zeus, whose dark eyes seemed to hold an understanding that went beyond mere animal instinct. The dog whimpered once, a sound filled with urgency and warning, then pressed against Tommy's legs as if trying to hold him back from whatever waited outside. "I have to go, boy," Tommy whispered, running his fingers through Zeus's thick coat one last time. "Whatever this is, I'll sort it out and come home. I promise." The moment Tommy stepped outside with his hands raised, chaos erupted. Officers rushed forward, forcing him to the ground with his face pressed against the cold concrete of his driveway. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists with a finality that made his stomach lurch. Behind him he could hear Zeus barking frantically, the sound growing more desperate as officers moved toward the garage. "The dog needs to be secured," Webb ordered, his voice carrying a strange edge of anticipation. "Zeus, no!" Tommy struggled against the officers holding him down as his companion charged toward the entrance. "Don't hurt him. He's just scared." The tranquilizer dart caught Zeus in the shoulder, and Tommy watched in horror as his best friend stumbled, confusion replacing aggression in those trusting brown eyes. Zeus tried to reach Tommy, his legs betraying him as the sedative took hold, and collapsed just 10 feet from where his owner knelt in handcuffs. "You bastards!" Tommy snarled, fighting uselessly against his restraints. "He never hurt anyone. He's not dangerous." Webb knelt beside Tommy, close enough that only he could hear the detective's next words. "Your dog's going to animal control. 72-hour hold, then probably euthanized. Aggressive animal, you understand, unless you confess right now and save everyone some time." The threat hit Tommy harder than any physical blow could have. Zeus was more than a pet. He was Tommy's anchor to sanity, the reason he got up each morning, the only living thing that understood his nightmares and loved him anyway. The thought of Zeus dying because of something Tommy didn't even understand was unbearable. "I didn't kill anyone," Tommy said through gritted teeth. "I don't know what evidence you think you have, but you're wrong." Webb's smile was cold and satisfied. "We found the murder weapon in your garage, Richardson. Your fingerprints are all over it. Robert Hayes was shot twice with a .38 Special registered to a Vincent Morrison. But Morrison's been out of state for a week. Funny how that gun ended up in your toolbox." The words made no sense. Tommy had never owned a gun, had never even held one since leaving the Army. The thought of using a weapon against a civilian, against someone like Hayes who had shown him nothing but kindness, was incomprehensible. As they loaded him into the patrol car, Tommy caught one last glimpse of Zeus lying motionless on the garage floor. The German shepherd's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, but his eyes were closed, and a thin line of drool leaked from his muzzle onto the concrete where they'd shared so many peaceful afternoons. The trial began 6 months later, and from the start, Tommy's fate seemed sealed. The evidence was overwhelming. The murder weapon found in his garage, his fingerprints on the handle, no alibi for the time of death. His court-appointed attorney, overwhelmed with cases and lacking resources for a thorough investigation, advised him to accept a plea bargain. Tommy refused. "I didn't kill Robert Hayes," he insisted during every meeting with his lawyer. "Someone set me up. Someone who knew enough about me to make it look convincing." But who? Tommy had kept to himself since returning from Afghanistan. Besides his customers and Zeus, he had no close relationships, no enemies that he knew of. The prosecution painted him as a troubled veteran, unstable and prone to violence, someone whose PTSD had finally boiled over into murder. Detective Webb testified as the lead investigator, his account of finding the evidence clinical and convincing. He described Tommy as evasive during questioning, uncooperative, showing no remorse for his alleged crime. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and found Thomas Richardson guilty of murder in the first degree. The gavel fell on July 15, 2018, sealing Tommy Richardson's fate with 3 words that echoed through the Coconino County Courthouse: "Death by injection." Tommy's legs nearly gave out as the judge pronounced sentence, his mind reeling not from fear of his own death, but from the crushing realization that he would never see Zeus again. In the gallery behind him, a handful of customers from his auto shop wept openly, unable to reconcile the gentle mechanic they knew with the cold-blooded killer the prosecution had painted. As guards led Tommy away in shackles, Detective Webb stood in the courthouse corridor, accepting congratulations from colleagues and prosecutors. To everyone watching, he was the dedicated officer who had brought a dangerous veteran to justice. Only Webb knew the truth, that justice had nothing to do with it. This was revenge, pure and simple, against a system that let veterans come home while his son lay cold in Flagstaff Cemetery. Zeus, meanwhile, had been saved from euthanization by Jose Martinez, a kind-hearted mechanic who had worked alongside Tommy for 3 years. Jose had arrived at the animal control facility on the 3rd day, his weathered hands shaking as he signed the adoption papers. He'd known Zeus since the dog was a puppy, had watched the bond between man and animal grow into something profound and unbreakable. "I'm not trying to replace Tommy," Jose had whispered to Zeus that first night as the German shepherd lay motionless in the corner of his garage. "But he'd want someone to take care of you." Zeus refused to eat for 6 days. Jose tried everything: premium dog food, hamburger meat, even steak cooked to perfection. The dog would sniff the offerings politely, then return to his vigil by the door, waiting for a master who would never come. Finally, Jose made a decision that would define the next 7 years of their lives together. He drove Zeus back to Richardson's auto repair. The garage stood empty, yellow police tape still fluttering from the doorframe like tragic bunting. Jose cut the tape and raised the bay door, letting Zeus inside. The dog immediately went to his old blanket in the corner, circling 3 times before lying down with a deep sigh that seemed to come from his soul. "Okay, boy," Jose said quietly. "We'll wait here." And so began Zeus's vigil. Every morning at 8 a.m., Jose would drive to Richardson's and open the garage. Zeus would take his position by the door, watching the street with patient, unwavering attention. At 5:30 p.m., the exact time Tommy used to close shop, Zeus would begin his most heartbreaking ritual. He would pace to the door, sit, and release a single, mournful howl that echoed through the empty building. The sound became legendary in Flagstaff. Neighbors set their watches by it. Children walking home from school would pause to listen, sensing something profound in that daily lament. Martha Henderson, who lived across the street, began leaving dog treats on her porch, but Zeus never touched them. His focus remained absolute, his hope unshakable. Tommy's first year on death row nearly broke him. Arizona State Prison's death row housed 43 condemned men in cells measuring 6 feet by 9 feet, smaller than the bathroom in his childhood home. The walls were painted industrial beige, and the single window looked out onto a concrete exercise yard surrounded by razor wire. He was allowed 1 hour of recreation per day, 3 showers per week, and visits from approved attorneys only. The nightmares from Afghanistan returned with vengeance, compounded now by visions of Zeus waiting at the garage door. In his dreams, Tommy could hear that daily howl, could see his companion growing thinner and grayer with each passing month. The prison psychiatrist, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, noted in her reports that Tommy spoke more about his dog than about his own impending execution. "I made him a promise," Tommy told her during one session, his hands shaking as he carved another small dog figurine from a piece of wood. "I told him I'd come home. Dogs don't understand lies. They don't understand that sometimes people can't keep their promises." Years 2 and 3 brought a parade of appeals, each one raising false hope before crashing against the wall of overwhelming evidence. Tommy's new attorney, provided by the Capital Defense Project, was thorough and dedicated, but she was fighting an uphill battle against Webb's careful frame-up. The fingerprints were real. The murder weapon had been found in Tommy's garage. His lack of an alibi made him appear guilty. Meanwhile, Zeus's vigil continued with clockwork precision. Jose had tried bringing the dog home to his own house, but Zeus would escape every time, somehow finding his way back to Richardson's auto repair despite being miles away. After the 4th escape, Jose gave up and simply made the garage comfortable for both of them. He installed a space heater for winter, brought a cot for himself, and settled into a routine that revolved around Zeus's unwavering schedule. The community began to take notice. Local news stations picked up the story of the loyal dog waiting for his condemned master. A Facebook page called Zeus Waits gained thousands of followers, with people from around the world sharing stories of their own faithful pets. But Zeus remained oblivious to his fame. His attention focused solely on the empty street where Tommy's pickup truck should have appeared. By year 4, Zeus's physical decline became noticeable. His muzzle had turned completely gray, and arthritis made his morning walks stiff and painful. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the veterinarian who examined him regularly, estimated that the dog had aged the equivalent of 15 human years in just 4. "He's dying of grief," she told Jose bluntly. "His heart is literally broken." Tommy's appeals were exhausted by year 5. The Arizona Supreme Court upheld his conviction, the U.S. Court of Appeals refused to hear his case, and the Supreme Court declined review. His execution date was set for December 16, 2024, exactly 7 years and 1 day after his arrest. The irony wasn't lost on Tommy. Zeus would have to endure one final night of waiting before learning that his master was never coming home. The final months of 2024 brought an unexpected development. A true crime podcast called Wrongful Conviction began investigating Tommy's case, drawn by the story of Zeus's loyalty and questions about the speed of Webb's investigation. The podcasters, led by investigative journalist Rebecca Chen, the daughter of Tommy's fallen squad leader, discovered several troubling inconsistencies in the case file. Why had Webb been the first and only officer to process the crime scene? Why had the security footage from Hayes's home mysteriously malfunctioned on the night of the murder? Why had no one followed up on Vincent Morrison's connection to Hayes, despite Morrison's known gambling problems and financial difficulties? Rebecca's investigation gained national attention, but legal channels moved slowly. Appeals courts were reluctant to overturn convictions based on new theories rather than new evidence. Tommy's execution date remained firm, and time was running out. On December 10, 2024, exactly 1 week before his scheduled execution, Tommy made his final request. Not for a last meal of prime rib and lobster, not for a final phone call to distant relatives who had abandoned him years ago, not for a visit from a priest or spiritual advisor. He wanted to see Zeus. The request stunned prison officials. In their experience, condemned men's final requests usually involved family members, spiritual comfort, or elaborate meals. No one had ever asked to see a pet, especially not a pet they hadn't seen in 7 years. Warden Bill Harrison found himself in uncharted territory. Prison regulations had no provisions for animal visits, and the security implications were significant. But something about Tommy's quiet dignity, his clean disciplinary record, and the international attention on his case made Harrison pause. "Why the dog?" Harrison asked during their final interview. "After 7 years, why not ask for something more traditional?" Tommy looked up from the wooden dog figurine he'd been carving. His 2555th, one for each day Zeus had waited. His eyes were clear and peaceful, showing no trace of the fear or anger Harrison expected from a man facing imminent death. "Because Zeus is the only one who never doubted my innocence," Tommy said simply. "He's been waiting for me every single day, believing I'd come home. The least I can do is say goodbye properly and tell him it's okay to stop waiting." Harrison authorized the visit. December 16, 2024, dawned cold and clear over the Arizona desert, the kind of crystalline morning that made the mountains surrounding Yuma State Prison look close enough to touch. Tommy Richardson had been awake since 4 a.m., sitting on the edge of his narrow cot, hands clasped between his knees, watching the sky slowly lighten through his cell window. In 18 hours, he would be dead. But first, after 2,555 days of separation, he would see Zeus again. The prison buzzed with unusual energy. Word of the unprecedented visit had spread through both the staff and inmate populations, creating a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and surprising sympathy. Even hardened criminals who had committed unspeakable acts found themselves moved by the story of a man whose final wish was simply to say goodbye to his dog. At 10 a.m., a white van pulled through the prison's outer gates, carrying precious cargo. Jose Martinez sat in the passenger seat, his weathered hands nervously adjusting his collar, while Dr. Amanda Rodriguez drove with careful precision. In the back, separated by a steel mesh barrier, Zeus lay on a thick blanket, his graying muzzle resting on his paws. At 9 years old, he showed every day of his age: stiff joints, clouded eyes, a coat that had lost much of its lustrous black and tan shine. But when the van stopped and the rear doors opened, Zeus lifted his head with an alertness that surprised everyone present. "Easy, boy," Jose murmured, attaching a lead to Zeus's collar. "Today's different. Today we're going to see Tommy." The words meant nothing to Zeus. He'd heard Tommy's name spoken thousands of times over the years without result. But something in the air, some change in routine and scent, made his ears prick forward with cautious interest. As they led him through the prison's processing area, Zeus's nose worked overtime, cataloging the smells of concrete, disinfectant, and human fear that permeated the facility. Detective Marcus Webb had volunteered for security duty, ostensibly to ensure the visit proceeded safely. In reality, he needed to be present to monitor the situation, to ensure that nothing was said or done that might threaten the careful lie he'd constructed 7 years earlier. Webb stood in the observation area overlooking the prison yard, watching through reinforced glass as guards prepared the space for the unprecedented reunion. The yard itself was a rectangle of concrete surrounded by 20-foot walls topped with razor wire. A single picnic table sat in the center, flanked by 2 metal chairs. Guard towers at each corner provided overwatch, their windows reflecting the harsh desert sun like unblinking eyes. It was here, in this sterile environment designed to contain society's most dangerous criminals, that one of the most profound reunions in the prison's history was about to unfold. Tommy was brought out at 2 p.m. exactly, his hands cuffed in front of him, an unusual courtesy granted by Warden Harrison. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on his frame. 7 years of prison food and stress had carved away much of the muscle he'd built during his army days, but his eyes were alert and focused as he scanned the yard, searching for the companion he'd dreamed about every night for over 7 years. Zeus appeared at the far gate, led by 2 guards and followed closely by Jose and Dr. Rodriguez. The German shepherd moved slowly, his arthritis obvious in the careful way he placed each paw. His head was down, showing little interest in his surroundings, until the wind shifted and carried a familiar scent across the concrete expanse. The transformation was immediate and heartbreaking. Zeus's head snapped up, ears forward, nostrils flaring as he processed the impossible. His tail, which had hung limp for years, began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm as his eyes locked onto the figure in orange standing 30 feet away. "Zeus!" Tommy's voice broke on the single word, carrying 7 years of longing and regret across the yard. The German shepherd pulled against his lead, whimpering with an urgency that made several guards step back in surprise. This wasn't the tired, defeated animal they'd expected. This was a dog who had suddenly remembered what joy felt like. "Let him go!" Tommy called out, his voice stronger now. "Please, he won't hurt anyone." The lead guard looked to the observation window where Warden Harrison stood. A single nod gave permission, and Zeus was released from his restraints. What happened next would be talked about in the prison for years to come. Zeus didn't run. His old joints wouldn't allow it. Instead, he moved in a limping trot that somehow conveyed more urgency than a full sprint, covering the distance between them with single-minded determination. 20 feet, 10 feet, 5 feet, and then they were together. Tommy dropped to his knees just as Zeus reached him, and the German shepherd's front paws landed on his shoulders with enough force to nearly knock him backward. But Tommy held on, burying his face in the familiar fur of Zeus's neck, breathing in the scent that had comforted him through countless nightmares in a different life. Zeus whimpered and whined, pressing against Tommy as if trying to merge their bodies into one. His tail wagged so hard it became a blur, and he alternated between pressing his muzzle against Tommy's face and pulling back to stare at him, as if confirming that this wasn't another dream. "I'm sorry, boy," Tommy whispered, his voice muffled by Zeus's coat. I'm so sorry I couldn't come home. I tried, Zeus. God knows I tried. For 10 minutes they existed in their own world. Tommy told Zeus about prison, about the wooden dogs he'd carved, about the nights he'd dreamed of their walks through the forest. Zeus listened with the patient attention that had always been his greatest gift, occasionally licking Tommy's face or pressing closer when he sensed distress. The guards watching found themselves profoundly moved. Officer Janet Davis, a 20-year veteran of the corrections system, wiped away tears she hadn't expected to shed. In all my years here, she would later tell her husband, I've never seen love like that. Pure, unconditional, unchanged by time or circumstances. But Zeus's demeanor began to change as the visit continued. His ears, which had been soft and relaxed during the reunion, gradually sharpened to attention. His head turned toward the observation area, nostrils flaring as he processed scents carried on the desert wind. Something was making him uneasy. Detective Webb stood at the observation window, studying the scene below with calculating eyes. He'd expected some emotional display. Dogs were predictably sentimental creatures. But he hadn't anticipated the intensity of the reunion. More concerning was the way several guards seemed genuinely affected by what they were witnessing. Sympathy could lead to questions, and questions were dangerous. Zeus's unease intensified when Webb descended to the yard level, ostensibly to check on security arrangements. The moment the detective appeared in Zeus's line of sight, the German shepherd's entire body language shifted. His ears flattened against his skull, lips pulling back to expose teeth yellowed with age but still capable of inflicting damage. A low growl rumbled from Zeus's chest. Not the warning growl of a territorial animal, but something deeper and more primal. It was the sound of recognition, of instinctive knowledge that here stood an enemy. Tommy felt the change immediately. Zeus, what's wrong, boy? The German shepherd moved to position himself between Tommy and Webb, his hackles rising along his neck and shoulders. The growl intensified, becoming a sound so menacing that several guards instinctively stepped back. Jesus, muttered Officer Rodriguez, hand moving toward his radio. That dog's going aggressive. But Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, who had been observing from a safe distance, stepped forward with professional interest. No, she said firmly, this isn't aggression. This is recognition. Zeus knows that man from somewhere, and whatever the association is, it's negative. Webb attempted to approach casually, hands visible and empty. Easy there, dog. Nobody's going to hurt anyone. Zeus's response was immediate and unmistakable. The growl escalated to a bark, sharp, warning, and filled with an authority that made everyone in the yard pause. His body remained coiled, ready to spring, every muscle tensed for action despite his age and arthritis. Tommy placed a calming hand on Zeus's back, feeling the rigid tension in his companion's frame. In all their years together, he'd never seen Zeus react this way to anyone. The German shepherd was normally gentle with strangers, perhaps wary but never hostile. This level of focused aggression was completely out of character. He's trying to tell us something, Tommy said, his voice carrying a certainty that surprised him. Zeus doesn't act like this without reason. Never has. Webb forced a laugh, but Officer Davis noticed the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes avoided direct contact with the dog. Animals can be unpredictable, he said, especially when they're stressed or confused. But Zeus wasn't confused. As Webb spoke, the dog's focus intensified, his gaze never leaving the detective's face. It was as if he was trying to communicate something urgent, something vital that only he understood. The visit continued for another 20 minutes, but the dynamic had fundamentally changed. Zeus remained alert and protective, positioning himself as a barrier between Tommy and Webb whenever the detective moved within 30 feet. His behavior was so consistent and specific that even skeptical guards began to take notice. As the time came to end the visit, Tommy knelt beside Zeus one final time. "I have to go now, boy, but you've given me something important today. You've reminded me to trust my instincts, just like you're trusting yours." Zeus whimpered as the lead was reattached, but his eyes never left Webb's position. Even as he was led away, the German shepherd kept looking back, his warning clear to anyone willing to listen. In the observation area, Warden Harrison made a note in Tommy's file. Subject's dog exhibited extreme agitation toward Detective Webb. Reason unknown but consistent throughout visit. It was a small notation, seemingly insignificant, but in the hours that followed it would become the thread that unraveled 7 years of carefully constructed lies. The hours after Zeus's departure stretched like a funeral procession through Arizona State Prison. Tommy sat in his cell staring at the concrete wall where he'd scratched 2,555 small marks, one for each day Zeus had waited. In 8 hours, he would walk to the execution chamber, and Zeus would finally understand that his vigil was over. The thought of his companion waiting by that garage door tomorrow evening, howling into emptiness, was more unbearable than his own approaching death. Officer Janet Davis couldn't shake the image of Zeus's reaction to Detective Webb. In 20 years of corrections work, she'd developed an instinct for reading situations, and something about the dog's behavior nagged at her like a splinter under the skin. Dogs didn't lie. They couldn't manufacture hatred or fake recognition. Zeus had known Webb from somewhere, and that knowledge had triggered pure, primal fear. At 6 p.m., as the evening shift took over, Davis made a decision that would change everything. She pulled Webb's file from the administrative database, something she had no official reason to do but felt compelled to investigate. What she found raised immediate red flags. Webb had been the first responding officer to the Hayes murder scene, arriving a full 12 minutes before backup, despite being logged as off-duty that night. His report was unusually brief, lacking the detailed observations that characterized his other case files. More troubling was Webb's personal timeline during 2017. His son David had died in December, the same month as the Hayes murder. Webb had taken extended bereavement leave immediately following his son's death, returning to duty just 3 days before Tommy's arrest. The psychological evaluation required for his return to active duty had been cursory at best, signed off by a department psychologist who had since retired. Davis called her former partner, Detective Ray Holloway, who had worked closely with Webb for 5 years before transferring to the Phoenix Police Department. Holloway's voice turned grim when she explained her concerns. "Marcus was never the same after David died," Holloway told her. "The kid was everything to him. When that drunk veteran killed the boy, something broke inside Marcus that I don't think ever healed. He started talking about how veterans got special treatment, how they came home and destroyed families while being called heroes." "Did he ever mention Tommy Richardson specifically?" Davis asked. "Not by name, but he was obsessed with veterans in the area. He'd run their plates during traffic stops, looking for any excuse to hassle them. I thought it was just grief talking, but now—" Holloway's voice trailed off as the implications became clear. Davis hung up and immediately called Warden Harrison at home. The conversation was brief but urgent, and within an hour Harrison was back at the prison, convening an emergency meeting with the execution team. Meanwhile, in the maximum security wing, Tommy lay on his cot thinking about Zeus's warning. His companion had tried to tell him something important, something that went beyond simple animal instinct. In Afghanistan, Tommy had learned to trust his gut feelings about people and situations. His survival had often depended on reading subtle cues that his conscious mind couldn't process. Zeus possessed that same intuitive intelligence, honed by millions of years of evolution and 4 years of intimate bonding with Tommy. The dog had recognized Webb as a threat, not just any threat, but a specific, personal danger. As Tommy replayed the scene in his mind, he remembered Webb's nervous energy, the way the detective had avoided looking directly at Zeus, the tremor in his hands when the dog began growling. Those weren't the reactions of an innocent man dealing with an unpredictable animal. At 9 p.m., 3 hours before the scheduled execution, Warden Harrison received a call that would change the course of the evening. Detective Holloway had driven straight from Phoenix, bringing with him a file he'd been quietly assembling for months. The file contained information about Vincent Morrison, Robert Hayes's business partner, who had been arrested in Phoenix 6 months earlier for armed robbery. Morrison was facing 25 years to life under Arizona's repeat offender statute, and his attorney had been exploring plea bargain options. During one of these negotiations, Morrison had made cryptic references to knowing things about the Hayes murder that could be valuable to prosecutors. At the time, nobody had taken the claims seriously. Morrison was a known manipulator who had tried similar tactics in previous cases. But now, with Zeus's warning fresh in everyone's mind and questions mounting about Webb's conduct, Morrison's claims took on new significance. Holloway had interviewed Morrison that afternoon, and what he learned sent shockwaves through the investigation. Morrison admitted to killing Robert Hayes, but his story diverged dramatically from the official narrative. According to Morrison, he had indeed been caught at the scene by Detective Webb, but instead of arresting him, Webb had made a deal. For $25,000, Webb would frame someone else for the murder. Specifically, a troubled veteran who fit the profile of someone the jury would easily convict. Webb hated veterans, Morrison told Holloway through the prison phone. His kid got killed by one and he blamed all of them. He saw Tommy Richardson as the perfect patsy, isolated, mentally unstable, no strong alibi. Webb planted the gun himself, used fingerprints he'd lifted during some traffic stop. The confession was detailed and specific, including information about the crime scene that had never been released to the public. Morrison described how Webb had coached him on altering his story, how they had arranged for Morrison to disappear for several days to establish an alibi, and how Webb had destroyed the security footage from Hayes's home. As Morrison's confession reached the prison, Tommy was undergoing the final preparations for execution. Prison barber Miguel Santos shaved Tommy's head and legs where the electrodes would be attached, his hands trembling slightly as he worked. Santos had been cutting hair at the prison for 15 years, but he'd never prepared someone he genuinely believed might be innocent. "Mijo," Santos whispered in Spanish, his voice barely audible. "I've seen a lot of guilty men in this chair. You're not one of them." Tommy nodded gratefully but said nothing. As speaking would require energy he needed to conserve for what was coming. Instead, he thought about Zeus, probably curled up on his blanket at the garage, unaware that his long wait was finally ending. The execution chamber was prepared with clinical efficiency. The gurney was positioned precisely in the center of the room, IV lines tested and retested, witnesses seated behind reinforced glass. Tommy's last meal, a simple cheeseburger and fries that he hadn't been able to finish, sat abandoned in his cell. At 10:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the scheduled execution, Warden Harrison's phone rang. The caller was Morrison's attorney, confirming that his client was prepared to give a full confession in exchange for a reduced sentence. The confession implicated Detective Webb as an accessory after the fact, and detailed how the frame-up had been orchestrated. Harrison faced an impossible decision. The execution was scheduled for 11:59 p.m., giving him less than 90 minutes to verify Morrison's claims and potentially halt the proceedings. The political pressure was enormous. Tommy's case had attracted national attention, and any delay would be scrutinized by media and politicians alike. But Harrison thought about Zeus's reaction, about the dog's instinctive recognition of danger, about an innocent man preparing to die for a crime he didn't commit. At 10:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Tommy was scheduled to be moved to the execution chamber, Harrison made the call. The execution was stayed pending investigation of new evidence. Tommy was in the holding cell adjacent to the execution chamber when guards came to deliver the news. He'd already undergone the final security check, had his last conversation with the prison chaplain, and mentally prepared himself for death. The stay felt like a cruel joke, another twist in a nightmare that had already lasted 7 years. "What kind of evidence?" Tommy asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion. "The kind that might prove you're innocent," Officer Davis told him, her eyes bright with tears she no longer tried to hide. "Your dog knew something we didn't. Zeus tried to tell us who the real killer was." As news of the stay spread through the prison, an unusual thing happened. Hardened criminals, men who had committed unspeakable acts, began cheering in their cells. They had witnessed something pure in Tommy's love for Zeus, something that reminded them of their own capacity for loyalty and devotion. Outside the prison walls, Zeus lay sleeping on his blanket, unaware that his instincts had just saved an innocent man's life. The interrogation room at Flagstaff Police Department had never hosted such explosive revelations. At 1:30 a.m. on December 17th, Vincent Morrison sat across from Detective Ray Holloway, Warden Harrison, and Tommy's court-appointed attorney, Maria Santos. Morrison's hands shook as he lit his 4th cigarette in an hour, the ashtray overflowing with evidence of his nervousness. The man who had killed Robert Hayes 7 years ago was finally ready to tell the truth. "I shot Hayes twice," Morrison began, his voice barely above a whisper. "First shot got him in the chest when he lunged for the phone. Second shot, that was when he was crawling toward the safe, begging me not to kill him." The confession spilled out in agonizing detail. Morrison described the gambling debts that had driven him to desperation, the argument with Hayes that had escalated beyond control, the moment when he pulled the trigger and watched his business partner die. But the most damning part of his story involved Detective Marcus Webb's arrival at the scene. "Webb found me standing over the body at 4:43 a.m., Morrison continued, ash falling from his trembling cigarette. "I thought my life was over. Then he looked at all that cash on the floor, looked at me, and said something I'll never forget. My son would have been 9 years old next month." According to Morrison, Webb had stood in Hayes's living room for almost 10 minutes, staring at the blood and money while making a decision that would destroy an innocent man's life. The detective's grief over his son's death had twisted into something dark and vengeful, and Tommy Richardson represented everything Webb blamed for his loss. "Webb told me he'd been watching Richardson for months," Morrison said, "called him a broken soldier who'd probably snap eventually anyway, said he was doing society a favor by taking him off the streets. The frame-up had been methodical and professional." Webb had instructed Morrison to leave through the back door, taking his car and disappearing for 72 hours to establish an alibi. Meanwhile, Webb had planted the murder weapon in Tommy's garage, using fingerprints he'd lifted during a routine traffic stop 3 weeks earlier. The detective had even coached Morrison on what to say if questioned, creating a story that placed Morrison out of state during the murder. Detective Holloway leaned forward, his face grim. "Why didn't you come forward sooner? An innocent man has been on death row for 7 years." Morrison's eyes filled with tears. "Webb said if I ever talked, he'd make sure I got the death penalty too. Said he had enough evidence to make it look like I was the mastermind. I was scared, and I convinced myself that Richardson probably was guilty of something else anyway." As Morrison's confession continued, Webb himself was being located by Phoenix police officers. They found him at a roadside motel 30 miles outside Flagstaff, apparently preparing to flee. His patrol car was packed with personal belongings, and he'd withdrawn his entire savings account earlier that evening. The timing suggested he'd known that Morrison might eventually break. Webb's arrest at 3:15 a.m. was anticlimactic. The detective who had built his reputation on bringing criminals to justice offered no resistance when handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He sat silently in the back of the patrol car, staring out the window at the desert landscape that had been his jurisdiction for 15 years. Back at the prison, Tommy had been moved from the death row holding cell to a regular maximum security cell, pending the investigation's outcome. He sat on the narrow cot, still processing the news that his execution had been stayed. The concept of hope felt foreign after 7 years of counting down to his own death. Part of him wondered if this was just another cruel twist, a delay that would ultimately lead to the same inevitable conclusion. Officer Janet Davis brought him coffee at 4 a.m., her face showing the exhaustion of a night that had upended everything she thought she knew about the case. "Your dog saved your life," she told Tommy simply. "Zeus knew Webb was dirty before any of us figured it out." The mention of Zeus brought tears to Tommy's eyes. His companion's behavior in the prison yard suddenly made perfect sense. Zeus had recognized Webb's scent from that terrible night 7 years ago, had remembered the man who had destroyed their life together. The dog's instincts had been trying to warn everyone that the real killer was standing right there, wearing a badge and pretending to seek justice. Meanwhile, at Richardson's auto repair, Zeus lay restless on his blanket. The old German shepherd seemed to sense that something fundamental had changed. He paced to the garage door several times during the night, whimpering softly, as if he could feel the shift in the universe that might finally bring his master home. Jose Martinez had arrived at the garage at 3 a.m. after receiving a call from Dr. Rodriguez about the developments at the prison. He found Zeus more agitated than he'd seen him in years, the dog's tail wagging intermittently as if he was picking up on emotions he couldn't fully understand. "Easy, boy," Jose whispered, scratching behind Zeus's graying ears. "Maybe your long wait is finally ending." Webb's formal interrogation began at sunrise. In the same room where he'd questioned countless suspects over the years, the detective found himself on the other side of the table. Detectives from the Arizona Department of Public Safety had taken over the case to avoid any appearance of conflict of interest within the Flagstaff Police Department. For the first 2 hours, Webb maintained his innocence, claiming that Morrison was lying to save himself. But as evidence mounted, bank records showing the mysterious deposit, security footage from a gas station showing Webb's patrol car near Tommy's garage on the night of the planting, testimony from other officers about Webb's obsession with veterans, his story began to crumble. The breaking point came when investigators presented Webb with a photograph from the prison yard visit, showing Zeus's aggressive posture and focused attention on the detective. The image captured something primal and undeniable, a dog's absolute certainty that this man was dangerous. "That animal recognized you," Detective Sarah Chen told Webb. "Dogs don't forget scents, especially traumatic ones. Zeus remembered you from the night you destroyed his family." Webb's composure finally shattered. Tears streamed down his face as he spoke about his son, David, about the drunk veteran who had killed the boy, about the rage that had consumed him for months after the funeral. The confession poured out in broken sentences punctuated by sobs. "I saw Richardson, and all I could think about was David," Webb said. "Every veteran who came home safe was a mockery of my dead son. When Morrison offered me that money, it wasn't about the cash, it was about making them pay." He described the frame-up in detail, confirming everything Morrison had revealed. Webb had studied Tommy for weeks before the murder, learning his routines, his isolation, his vulnerability. The detective had seen Tommy as the perfect scapegoat, a troubled veteran with PTSD whom a jury would easily convict. The most chilling part of Webb's confession was his lack of remorse for Tommy's suffering. Even as he admitted to framing an innocent man, Webb maintained that veterans like Tommy were ticking time bombs who would eventually commit crimes anyway. Richardson's PTSD made him dangerous, Webb insisted. I just accelerated the inevitable. By 10 a.m., the legal machinery was moving rapidly to correct 7 years of injustice. The district attorney, faced with overwhelming evidence of prosecutorial misconduct, filed an emergency motion to vacate Tommy's conviction. Judge Patricia Morrison, no relation to Vincent Morrison, scheduled an immediate hearing to review the new evidence. Tommy was transported to the courthouse in shackles, but the atmosphere was dramatically different from his original trial. Media crews lined the streets, many carrying signs reading, "Free Tommy Richardson," and Zeus knew the truth. The dog's role in exposing the corruption had captured public imagination, turning Zeus into an unlikely hero. Inside the courtroom, Tommy sat beside his attorney as Judge Morrison reviewed the evidence. Morrison's confession, Webb's admission, the financial records, and the expert testimony about Zeus's behavior created an overwhelming case for Tommy's innocence. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Morrison said, her voice heavy with the weight of the moment, "the court finds that you were wrongfully convicted based on fabricated evidence. All charges against you are hereby dismissed, and you are free to go." The words echoed through the courtroom like thunder. Tommy's legs nearly gave out as the reality hit him. After 2,556 days in prison, 2,556 nights of dreaming about Zeus, 2,556 mornings of waking up to concrete walls and the smell of disinfectant, he was finally going home. But as the shackles were removed from his wrists, Tommy's first thought wasn't of freedom. It was of Zeus, waiting at the garage door, finally about to see his faith rewarded. The courtroom erupted in cheers from supporters who had followed the case. Maria Santos, Tommy's attorney, wiped away tears as she embraced her client. "Zeus saved you," she whispered. "That dog's love literally brought you back from the dead." Outside the courthouse, Jose Martinez waited with Zeus in his truck. The German shepherd seemed to understand that something momentous was happening. His ears were perked forward, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes fixed on the courthouse doors as if he knew his master was somewhere inside. As Tommy emerged into the Arizona sunlight, a free man for the first time in 7 years, he spotted Jose's truck across the street. Through the windshield, he could see a familiar silhouette. Graying muzzle, alert ears, and eyes that had never stopped believing in his return. Tommy ran across the street, ignoring the shouts of reporters and the flash of cameras. Zeus saw him coming and began barking with joy, his voice carrying 7 years of faithful waiting and unshakable hope. When Tommy opened the truck door, Zeus leaped into his arms with surprising strength for a 9-year-old dog. They held each other in the parking lot while the world watched, 2 souls finally reunited after an eternity of separation. "I kept my promise, boy," Tommy whispered into Zeus's fur. "I came home." The drive back to Richardson's auto repair felt like traveling through a dream. Tommy sat in the passenger seat of Jose's pickup truck, his right hand buried deep in Zeus's coat while his left gripped the door handle as if anchoring himself to reality. 7 years of prison had left him unaccustomed to movement faster than a walking pace, and the simple act of watching Arizona landscape blur past the windows overwhelmed his senses. Zeus never took his eyes off Tommy's face during the 20-minute drive. The German shepherd's tail hadn't stopped wagging since the courthouse, and he kept pressing his muzzle against Tommy's neck, breathing in the scent he'd been dreaming about for 2,556 nights. Occasionally Zeus would whimper softly, a sound that seemed to ask, "Are you real? Are you finally home? He's been waiting for you every single day," Jose said, his voice thick with emotion. "Rain or shine, Zeus has been at that garage door at 5:30 p.m. for 7 years. The whole town knows about it. People set their watches by his howl." The garage came into view as they turned onto Maple Street, and Tommy's breath caught in his throat. The building looked smaller than he remembered, the paint more faded, the Richardson's auto repair sign weathered by desert sun and mountain snow. But it was home, the only real home he'd known since returning from Afghanistan. Jose had maintained the garage meticulously during Tommy's imprisonment, keeping the equipment serviced and the space ready for the day that many people thought would never come. A hand-painted sign by the door read, "Zeus's Place," and the concrete floor bore the wear patterns of a dog who had paced the same route thousands of times. As they pulled into the driveway, Zeus began trembling with excitement. This was the moment he'd been preparing for every day since Tommy's arrest, the return of his pack leader, his best friend, his entire world. When the truck stopped, Zeus practically vibrated with anticipation until Tommy opened the door and they both stepped onto familiar ground. The first thing Tommy noticed was Zeus's bed in the corner. Not the old blanket he remembered, but a proper orthopedic bed that Jose had bought to ease the arthritis in the aging dog's joints. Beside it sat food and water bowls, a collection of toys that Zeus had never played with, and a framed photograph of Tommy in his army uniform. "I brought him here every day," Jose explained, watching as Zeus immediately went to his favorite spot by the large bay door. "He wouldn't eat at my house, wouldn't sleep anywhere else. This garage became his whole world." Tommy knelt beside Zeus, running his hands over the dog's graying coat, feeling the changes that 7 years had wrought. Zeus was thinner than before, his muzzle completely white now, his movements careful and deliberate. But his eyes still held the same intelligence, the same unwavering devotion that had sustained Tommy through the darkest moments of his imprisonment. "I'm sorry I was gone so long, boy," Tommy whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry you had to wait." Zeus responded by placing his head in Tommy's lap, a gesture so familiar and natural that it seemed to bridge the 7-year gap in an instant. They sat together on the garage floor as the Arizona sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Tommy had only seen through prison windows for too long. The media attention was overwhelming, but not unwelcome. Tommy's story had captured national imagination, the loyal dog who waited 7 years, the corrupt detective who framed an innocent veteran, the instinctive recognition that exposed the truth. News crews from major networks had descended on Flagstaff, and the Zeus Waits Facebook page had gained over 1 million followers in 24 hours. But Tommy's focus remained entirely on Zeus. They slept together that first night on the garage floor, Tommy on an air mattress that Jose had provided, Zeus curled against his side just as he had years ago. The dog's breathing was more labored now, occasionally interrupted by soft wheezes that spoke to his advanced age, but his contentment was absolute. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez visited the next morning to examine Zeus, bringing with her a complete medical workup. The news was bittersweet. Zeus was healthy for a 9-year-old German shepherd, but the years of waiting had taken their toll. His heart showed signs of stress, his joints were arthritic, and his overall life expectancy was perhaps 2 years at most. He kept himself alive through sheer willpower, Dr. Rodriguez told Tommy as Zeus lay patiently during the examination. "This dog has been running on love and determination for years. Now that you're back, he can finally rest." The community response was extraordinary. Within a week, Richardson's auto repair was flooded with customers who had heard Tommy's story and wanted to support his new beginning. The mayor of Flagstaff presented Tommy with a key to the city, and the governor issued a formal apology for the state's failure to protect an innocent citizen. A GoFundMe campaign organized by Rebecca Chen, the journalist whose podcast had helped expose the truth, raised over $300,000 for Tommy's rehabilitation and Zeus's medical care. Letters poured in from around the world, veterans sharing their own stories of animal companions, families offering support, children sending drawings of dogs and soldiers. Detective Marcus Webb was sentenced to 15 years in prison for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice. Vincent Morrison received a reduced sentence of 12 years in exchange for his cooperation. The Flagstaff Police Department implemented sweeping reforms to prevent future corruption, and Webb's conviction led to reviews of other cases he had investigated. But for Tommy, the most important victory was much simpler. Each morning, he woke up to Zeus's gentle nudging, reminding him that breakfast time had arrived. They established new routines, slow walks around the neighborhood to accommodate Zeus's arthritis, afternoons spent in the garage where Zeus could supervise Tommy's work, evenings on the front porch watching the sunset over the San Francisco peaks. Zeus seemed to understand that his long vigil was finally over. The frantic energy that had characterized his waiting years gave way to a peaceful contentment. He no longer paced to the door at 5:30 p.m., no longer howled his daily lament. Instead, he simply enjoyed being with Tommy, savoring every moment of their reunion. 3 months after Tommy's release, on a warm spring morning in March 2025, Zeus didn't get up for breakfast. Tommy found him lying peacefully on his bed, his breathing shallow but steady, his eyes still bright with recognition when he saw his master's face. Dr. Rodriguez came immediately, but her examination confirmed what Tommy already knew. Zeus's heart was failing, and his time was measured in hours rather than days. She offered to ease his passing with medication, but Tommy declined. "He waited 7 years for me," Tommy said, settling beside Zeus on the garage floor. "The least I can do is wait with him." Zeus passed away that evening as the sun set behind the mountains, his head resting in Tommy's lap, surrounded by the familiar smells and sounds of the garage that had been his sanctuary. His last act was to lift his head slightly and lick Tommy's hand, a final gesture of love and gratitude. The funeral was unlike anything Flagstaff had ever seen. Hundreds of people attended, including veterans from across the Southwest, police officers who had been inspired by Zeus's story, and families whose own pets had provided comfort during difficult times. Zeus was buried in the pet cemetery overlooking the town, his headstone reading simply, "Zeus, he never stopped believing." Tommy continued operating Richardson's auto repair, finding purpose in honest work and in sharing Zeus's story with visitors from around the world. He began speaking at veteran support groups, telling them about the power of unconditional love and the importance of never giving up hope. And every evening at sunset, Tommy would sit on his front porch and look toward the mountains, remembering a German shepherd who had taught him that some bonds transcend time, injustice, and even death itself. Zeus had kept the faith when no one else would, had recognized the truth when everyone else was blind, and had proven that love, pure, patient, and unwavering, could indeed conquer all. This story reminds us that the most profound love often comes without conditions, without judgment, and without the complexity that human relationships sometimes carry. Zeus waited 12,556 days, not because he understood legal systems or evidence, but because his heart knew something the courts had missed. In a world where loyalty seems increasingly rare, where technology replaces connection, and where cynicism often overshadows faith, Zeus represents something we all long for: unwavering devotion that transcends time and circumstance. For those of us who've lived long enough to experience loss, betrayal, and the weight of unfulfilled promises, Zeus's story strikes at something fundamental. We've all waited for someone, a child to call, a friend to return, a dream to be fulfilled. We understand the ache of hope deferred and the miracle of faith rewarded. Tommy's story isn't just about a wrongfully convicted veteran. It's about the redemptive power of love that refuses to give up, even when everyone else has moved on. In our golden years, when we question what legacy we'll leave behind, Zeus shows us that sometimes the greatest gift we can offer is simply showing up, day after day, believing in someone when they can't believe in themselves. What relationship in your life has shown you this kind of unwavering loyalty? Have you ever had an animal companion whose devotion changed your perspective on love and faith? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear about the Zeus in your life.